Mara had been standing in front of the cereal for 4 minutes when she noticed she was crying. Not sobbing. Nothing dramatic. Just a thin, embarrassing wetness at the corner of one eye, the kind that could still be blamed on allergies if anyone asked, though no one was going to ask because it was 10:40 on a Tuesday morning and the only other person in the aisle was a stock boy restacking granola bars with the specific weariness of someone counting the minutes until his break. Mara wiped her eye with the back of her wrist and looked again at the wall of boxes in front of her. 40-some varieties. Clusters. Clusters with dried fruit. Dried fruit, no clusters, for reasons she found, in that moment, genuinely upsetting. She was not crying about cereal. She wanted to be extremely clear with herself about that standing there, because if she was crying about cereal then something had gone seriously wrong with her, and she preferred to believe that what had gone wrong was simply that she had 41 days from today to accept or decline a job in Lisbon that would double her salary, put her design work in front of the kind of clients she'd spent a decade trying to reach, and require her to leave David and the apartment they'd slowly, patiently built into something that felt like a life and the whole shape of the future she had without ever quite deciding to, she realized now, standing in the cereal aisle, already assumed she would have. 41 days. She had made a list. Then a second list when the first one felt dishonest. She had talked to her sister, who said take it, obviously, and to her mother, who said don't be ridiculous, you have a good man and a good life right here, and to David himself, who had gone very quiet for a long time and then said, in the careful voice he used when he was trying not to make a decision for her, I want you to do what's right for you, which had felt, at the time, like generosity, and now, in the cereal aisle, felt like being handed a loaded gun and told to be careful with it. She picked up a box, put it down, picked up another. This was the fourth wall of boxes, so to speak, in 5 weeks. There had been the wall of Lisbon, and the wall of David, and the wall of her own vague, still forming sense that maybe none of the specific choices mattered as much as some deeper underlying question she couldn't quite name, a question about who she was supposed to become, and whether any of the paths in front of her actually led there, or whether there was simply a place that didn't exist, a story she'd absorbed from somewhere without ever checking if it was true. She bought the cereal, not the best one. There was no best one, just one with actual grain in it and a shape on the box she didn't hate, and drove home with the radio off because she didn't trust herself to listen to anything that might have an opinion. Her sister called that evening as she was standing at the stove, not really cooking anything, just moving a spoon through a pan of onions that had been ready 5 minutes ago. Did you email them back yet? Cass asked, no preamble. The way she always started conversations she'd clearly been rehearsing. I have 34 days. You had 41 days 34 days ago too, and you didn't email them back then either. That's not. Mara switched the phone to her other ear and turned the burner off. That's not how days work, Cass. You know what I mean. Mal, listen. You've wanted something like this since you were 26. I watched you build a whole portfolio around wanting this. You used to have their client list bookmarked. You had a folder on your laptop called Lisbon before there was ever an actual Lisbon job to put in it. This isn't a hard decision, it just feels hard because you're scared. It's not just about the job. I know it's not just about the job. That's exactly why I'm telling you to take it. You've spent 10 years building a life around David's steadiness, which is a good thing. He's a good man. I like him, but you cannot let his steady be the whole argument. Steady isn't the same as right. And what if I go and it's wrong? What if I get there and I've traded an actual, specific, good life for a story I told myself when I was 26 that isn't even true anymore? There was a pause on the line, the kind Cass only allowed herself when she was choosing her next words instead of firing off the first ones, which was rare enough that Mara noticed it. Then it's wrong, Cass said finally. And you'll know it's wrong, and you'll do something about it because that's who you are. But Ma, you're acting like there's a version of this where somebody hands you a guarantee first and you get to see the ending before you buy the ticket. There isn't. There's never going to be one. I can't give you one. Mum definitely can't give you one, even though God knows she'll act like she's got one printed out and laminated. You're just going to have to pick without the ending, like everybody else who's ever picked anything. Mara didn't say anything for a moment. In the pan, the onions had gone from soft to slightly too brown, and she didn't move to save them. That's not comforting, she said eventually. I know, Cass said. I'm not trying to comfort you. I'm trying to tell you the truth, which is that you already know what you want, and you're just waiting for someone else to be the one who said it first, so that if it goes badly, it's a little bit their fault too. And I love you, but I'm not going to do that for you. Nobody should. That's not fair to ask of a person. After they hung up, Mara stood in the kitchen for a long time, not eating the onions, thinking about the shape of what her sister had just refused to do for her, and how much, until that exact moment, she had wanted her to do it anyway. Her mother called 2 nights later unprompted, which was itself unusual, since her mother generally preferred to be called rather than to call, on the theory that it demonstrated better manners. I've been thinking about Lisbon, her mother said, without any of Cass's brisk efficiency, in the slower, more deliberate cadence she used when she'd rehearsed something and wanted it to land exactly as intended. And I want to say something, and I want you to actually hear it, rather than filing it away as your mother being difficult again. Okay. You have a good life here, Mara. A genuinely good one. Not everyone gets that, and I watched you build it piece by piece over 10 years, and I would truly hate to see you throw it away chasing something that sounds exciting on paper and turns out, in practice, to be loneliness in a city where you don't speak the language, with a job that eats every hour you have and leaves nothing for the parts of a life that actually make it worth living. I hear you. But... Her mother paused, and Mara heard something shift in her voice, some old certainty loosening its grip, however slightly. I also raised you to make your own decisions, and I notice that I keep telling you what to do as though you were still 19, and you are not 19, and I think the truth is I'm frightened of you leaving, and I've been dressing that fear up as wisdom, and that isn't fair to you. So I want to take back some of what I said before. Not all of it. I still think staying is probably the better choice. But I don't want you to stay because I told you to. If you stay, I want it to be because you decided it, not because you were managing your mother's feelings about it. Mara sat with this for a long moment, surprised, in a way she hadn't expected to be, by how much it changed the shape of the conversation to hear her mother say it plainly. "Why now?" she asked. "Why tell me this now?" "Because I talked to your sister," her mother admitted, with a trace of her old briskness returning, "and she told me, not very gently, that I was doing exactly what she'd accused herself of doing, which was trying to be the reason, one way or the other, so that whatever happened wouldn't feel entirely like yours. And I didn't love hearing it, but I think she was right. So, there it is. I don't get a vote, apparently. Neither does she. I suppose that's the whole terrible, freeing point of it." Mara laughed quietly, surprising herself. "That's almost exactly what I've been reading about." "Reading about where?" "A book David gave me years ago. I finally opened it." "Well," her mother said, in a tone that suggested she had no intention of asking further about the book, "whatever it says, I hope it also tells you that your mother loves you regardless of which door you walk through. Because that part, at least, I can promise you, is not up for negotiation." That night, unable to sleep, she found herself pulling an old paperback off the shelf that David had given her years ago, and she had never finished a battered translation of a lecture some French philosopher had given in 1945, the cover soft and grey from handling a name in yellow block letters, Sartre, that she associated vaguely with berets and cigarettes and college students being annoying at parties. She opened it on the couch with the lamp on low, mostly to have something to do with her hands, and read a sentence that made her sit up. Man is condemned to be free. She read it twice, then a third time. Something about the word condemned landed in her chest like a hand pressing down, not unkindly but firmly, the way a doctor presses on a bruise to see how deep it goes. Asterisk. Paris, October 1945. The club maintenant is not built to hold this many people, and it is holding them anyway badly, the way a coat one size too small still, technically, closes. Jean-Paul Sartre is being passed hand to hand over the heads of the crowd toward a small stage at the front because there is no aisle left to walk through, and somewhere in the crush a woman has fainted from the heat and is being fanned with someone's newspaper. The city outside is only months free of German occupation. The people packed into this hall have spent 6 years being told by one authority or another exactly what they were for the ride, for the resistance, for France, for God, for the dead, and Sartre, thin, cross-eyed, sweating through his shirt, is about to stand up and tell them that all of it, every neat and comforting story about what a person is asterisk for asterisk, was a kind of lie, and that underneath the lie is something far less comfortable and far more theirs. Outside, the boulevard still bears the marks of the liberation the year before, a bullet-pocked wall 2 streets over that no one has yet had the money or the inclination to repair, a faded poster for a Vichy propaganda campaign peeling at one corner beneath a fresher one advertising a dance hall reopening for business. The bread is still rationed. The coffee being served in the surrounding cafes is mostly chicory, and everyone drinking it has learned not to comment on the taste. It is, in other words, a city trying to remember how to want things again after 6 years of being told, in exhausting detail, what to want by an occupying power that has only just left, and a resistance movement whose heroic clarity, fight or collaborate, resist or submit, is proving far less useful now that the enemy has actually gone and the far murkier work of simply living has to resume. This is perhaps part of why the hall is so impossibly full tonight, why people have queued in the cold for the privilege of standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers to hear a philosopher talk about freedom, because for 6 years freedom had a single, clear, external shape, the freedom of France from occupation, and now that shape has been achieved and underneath it, unexpectedly, sits a colder, harder question that the newspapers have not been covering. What is a person once the war that defined them is over? What do you do with a life once no one is telling you what it's for? Among the crowd pressed against a support column near the back is a young man named Julian, 23 years old, still wearing the coat his brother left behind. His brother Etienne had been shot by the Gestapo 8 months earlier for a resistance cell Julian had never been permitted to join, too young, Etienne always said, though they both understood the real reason was that their mother could not survive losing both of them, and someone had to be kept in reserve. Now Etienne was gone anyway, and their mother sat most days in the same chair by the same window, and Julian had in his coat pocket a letter from a friend already fighting with the Free French forces in the East, inviting him to come finish what his brother started. He had gone 3 days earlier to see Sartre privately. A philosophy student he knew had arranged it, half as a favor and half as an experiment, curious what the famous existentialist would say to an actual, unresolved human dilemma instead of a seminar hypothetical. The meeting had taken place in a narrow office that smelled of pipe tobacco and damp paper. Sartre seated behind a desk crowded with proofs he was clearly meant to be correcting and clearly was not correcting, his bad eye drifting slightly to one side in a way Julian had found, at first, difficult not to stare at. "Tell me the situation," Sartre had said, without much ceremony, "and tell it to me plainly. I have very little patience left today for people who dress their problems up before they hand them to me." So Julian had told him. His brother, Etienne, 26 years old, shot in a courtyard in the 5th arrondissement for a resistance cell that would not take Julien because Julien was, at the time, only 19, and because someone had to be spared for their mother's sake, and it had been decided, without ever quite being said aloud, that Julien would be the one spared. His mother now, 8 months on, still sitting most days in the chair by the window that faced the street Etienne used to come home down, and the letter, folded twice in Julien's coat pocket, from a friend named Robert already serving with a Free French unit in the East, inviting him to come finish it, to come be, in some small and unspecified way, an answer to what had been done to his brother. So, Sartre said, when Julien had finished, "Your mother, who is alone and has already lost one son to this war, or the war itself, which took that son from her and which she would now, presumably, like to take something back from in return." Yes. And you have come to me to find out which one is correct. I suppose I have. Sartre was quiet for a moment, turning a pen over in his fingers, and when he spoke again his voice had lost some of its earlier brusqueness, had gone almost gentle, which Julien found disorientingly more unsettling than the brusqueness had been. "I cannot tell you," Sartre said. "You must have some." "I have nothing. Listen to me. If I told you to go, I would be telling you that an abstract cause, however just, outweighs a specific woman's specific and immediate grief, and I have no scale on which to weigh that, no more than you do. If I told you to stay, I would be telling you that private loyalty always outweighs a public duty, and I do not believe that either, not as a rule that could hold for every case, because I can imagine 100 cases where it plainly should not. There is no book, Julien, that contains the answer to your question. Not the Gospels. They will tell you to love your neighbor, but they will not tell you which neighbor takes the chair when the room is on fire and there is only one chair. Not Kant, who will tell you to treat every person as an end and never merely as a means, which is a fine thing to say and does nothing whatsoever to tell you what to do on a Tuesday when your mother is crying in the next room and your friend is waiting for your answer in a letter that is, at this moment, growing soft in your coat pocket. Then what use is any of it? The philosophy, the lecture you're giving next week, what is any of it for if it can't tell a person what to do? Sartre almost smiled at this, though it did not reach anything like warmth. It is not for telling you what to do. It is for telling you what is actually happening to you when you do it. You believe, I think, that somewhere out there is the correct choice sitting and waiting, and that your task is simply to find it, the way one finds a lost key. I am telling you there is no key. There is no lock. There is only you and your mother and Robert's letter and a decision that you alone are going to have to make, and then go on being the person who made it for the rest of your life without anyone else's signature on it to share the weight. I notice, by the way, that you came to me and not to a priest. That tells me something about which answer some part of you was already hoping to hear. Julien had left that office angrier than when he'd arrived, and it had taken him most of the walk home to understand that the anger was not really at Sartre. It was at the absence Sartre had refused to fill, the shape of a verdict Julien had wanted handed to him, blameless, the way a soldier is handed an order he did not choose and therefore cannot be entirely responsible for. Sartre would not become that officer. He had made this, gently, completely, unbearably clear. Sartre reaches the stage. The room quiets unevenly, the way a room does when it isn't sure yet whether it wants to. He begins to speak, and the phrase that will outlive nearly everything else he says that night arrives without ceremony, almost in passing, the way the most dangerous sentences often do. Man is condemned to be free. Julien feels it the way you feel a step that isn't there in the dark, a small, sickening drop in the stomach, a half-second of pure vertigo before your foot finds the ground again. Asterisk. Mara read the lecture twice through that week in stolen 20-minute pieces between work calls, and then found herself, on a Thursday, telling most of it to her therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Priya who had a habit of letting silences run a beat longer than felt comfortable. He says there's no essence, Mara said. No fixed nature waiting inside you to be discovered. You're not born with a purpose the way a knife is born with a purpose, sharp, made for cutting, done. He says a person exists first and only becomes something afterward through what they actually do. And I keep thinking, okay, fine, but then why does it feel like there's a right answer sitting somewhere out there that I just haven't found yet? Why does it feel like Lisbon is either the door to the life I'm supposed to have or the door away from it, and I just need enough information to know which? What would it feel like, Priya asked, if there wasn't a right answer sitting out there? Worse, Morris said immediately. Much worse. If there's a right answer, I just have to be smart enough or brave enough to find it. If there isn't one, then whatever I choose is just mine. All the way down. No appeal. Does that sound like freedom to you, or like something else? Mara thought about the cereal aisle, the 41 days shrinking, now to 34. David's careful voice. Her mother's certainty, her sister's certainty, two certainties pointing in opposite directions, both of them, she now understood with an unpleasant clarity, entirely useless because neither of them was the one who would wake up in 10 years inside whichever choice she made. It sounds like a sentence, she said. Like being sentenced to something. Priya didn't say anything for a while. Then there's a jam study. Do you know it? Mara shook her head. A grocery store puts out a table with 6 kinds of jam one day, 24 kinds another. More people stop to look at the 24. Almost nobody buys any of it. The 6 jam table, fewer people stop, but 10 times as many actually walk away with a jar. It's been replicated with retirement funds, dating profiles, college essay topics. Past a certain point, more options doesn't produce more satisfaction. It produces paralysis. And something worse than paralysis. When the paralysis finally breaks and a choice does get made, it produces regret because with 24 jams you remember all 23 you didn't pick, and some part of you keeps a private tally of what you might have missed. So the answer is fewer jams. The answer, Priya said, might be that the number of jams was never really the problem. The problem is what the 24 jams reveal, which is there the whole time, underneath even the 6 jam table, underneath every table, that no one is going to hand you a verdict. You are going to have to be the one who decides what a good jam even is for you, and then live with having decided it. Mara sat with that. Outside Priya's window, a bus went past, its brakes making a long, tired sound. That's what he meant, Mara said slowly. Condemned. It's not that freedom is bad. It's that there's no one else to blame. Not my mother's opinion, not my sister's, not even David being generous about it. If I go to Lisbon and it's wrong because I chose it. If I stay and I resent it in 5 years, that's mine too. There's no version where someone else did the choosing and I just get to be the person it happened to. How does that land? Priya asked, now that you've said it out loud. Mara expected to feel worse. Instead, unexpectedly, something in her chest that had been clenched for 5 weeks loosened by some small, almost negligible degree, not because the decision had gotten easier, but because she had stopped for the first time since the offer letter arrived, waiting for someone to make it easier for her. Asterisk. The following Monday, at the studio, Mara found herself standing in front of a different kind of wall, a corkboard, this time pinned with 22 logo concepts for a client who made artisanal soap, each one a slightly different arrangement of the same handful of ideas, a leaf, a droplet, a typeface either rounded or severe. Her junior designer, Theo, had done exactly what she'd asked, which was to generate options, as many strong options as he could manage, on the theory that more raw material meant a better final choice. He stood beside her now, visibly proud, waiting for her to pick a direction so he could refine it before Thursday's client call. Mara looked at the board for a long moment and felt something horribly, comically familiar rise in her chest, the same low hum of paralysis she'd felt in the cereal aisle, scaled down and dressed up in professional clothing. 22 logos. All of them, on some technical level, fine. None of them screaming to be chosen over the others. She could feel herself starting to do the thing she now, thanks to Priya, had a name for, waiting for an external verdict to arrive and save her from having to be the one who decided what good meant here, today, for this client, in this specific case. Which one do you like? Theo asked, objectively. There's no objectively, Mara said, more to herself than to him. That's the whole problem. If there were an objective answer sitting in this pile, I wouldn't be standing here feeling like this. Theo looked faintly alarmed, the way a 24-year-old looks when his boss says something that sounds like it might be about more than logos. Do you want me to cut it down to like 5? No, Mara said slowly, working something out as she said it. I want you to cut it down to 5, actually. Yes. But not because 5 is objectively better than 22. Because past a certain number, more options don't make the decision better, they just make it exhausting, and exhausted decisions are worse decisions, not more careful ones. There's research on this. Give a shopper 6 kinds of jam, more of them actually buy jam than if you give them 24. It sounds backwards, but it isn't. Past some threshold, the brain stops comparing and starts drowning. So we're doing 5 kinds of jam, Theo said, clearly enjoying himself now. We're doing 5 kinds of jam. Mara pulled 5 of the strongest concepts off the board with her own hands, not the objectively correct 5 she understood, because there was no such ranking waiting to be discovered, just 5 she genuinely responded to, chosen quickly, on instinct, before she could talk herself into a 6th or a 7th for the sake of covering herself. And then I'm going to pick one of these 5, and it's going to be because I picked it, not because the client's going to love it more than any human alternative in some measurable way. There isn't a way to measure that. There's just picking, and then making the one you picked good through the actual work of making it good. She caught herself a beat later hearing in her own words something close to what she'd read on the couch a week earlier, not a quotation exactly, more like an idea she'd absorbed deeply enough that it had started coming out of her mouth in her own voice, applied to soap logos, of all things, which struck her, walking back to her desk, as either very small or not small at all, depending on how you looked at it. Asterisk. She brought the soap logos up with Priya that same week, half embarrassed at how much space in her head a client project had suddenly started occupying alongside Lisbon and David and her mother's apology. There's a thing psychologists talk about, Priya said, when Mara had finished describing the corkboard, the 22 options, the 7 absurd paralysis. 2 kinds of decision makers. Maximizers who try to evaluate every option before choosing, looking for the objectively best one. And satisficers who set a bar for good enough and stop as soon as something clears it. You'd think the maximizers end up happier since they've theoretically found the best option out of everyone available. The research says the opposite. Maximizers report more regret, more anxiety during the choosing, and less satisfaction afterward, even when the thing they end up with is, by any outside measure, better than what the satisficer settled for. Why? Because comparing keeps every rejected option alive in your head. A satisficer picks the first sweater warm enough and reasonable looking, and the other sweaters just vanish. They're not real anymore. They were never chosen, so they don't have to be mourned. A maximizer picks the supposed best sweater out of 40, and all 39 rejected sweaters linger because the entire process was built on the premise that somewhere in there was a correct answer, and now that the choosing is done, some part of the mind keeps quietly wondering if it actually found it. Mara thought about the 22 logos, cut down to 5, cut down, eventually, to 1, a droplet shape she'd chosen because it made her feel something the others hadn't, not because a rigorous internal audit had crowned it superior. She thought about Lisbon and the folder on her laptop Cass had mentioned, the one that had existed before there was ever a real offer to put in it, built during years when Lisbon had been a fantasy rather than a decision, back when wanting it cost nothing because nothing was actually on the line. I think I've been a maximizer my whole life without ever having a word for it, she said slowly. I thought that was just what being careful looked like, making the pro-con list. Talking to everyone, weighing it and weighing it. I thought if I just gathered enough information, the right answer would eventually just become obvious, the way a math problem becomes obvious once you've done enough of the work. And has it? No, Mara said. That's the thing. It never has. Not once in 5 weeks. If anything, the more people I asked, the murkier it got because now I had 5 contradictory expert opinions instead of one honest uncertainty. So what would it look like, Priya asked, to be a satisficer about this one just this once? Not because the decision doesn't matter, it obviously matters enormously, but because the maximizing itself seems to be costing you more than it's giving you. Mara didn't answer right away. Outside, the same bus, or one very much like it, went past, its brakes making the same long, tired sound. It would look like picking the one that clears the bar, she said finally. The one that, when I imagine actually living inside it, doesn't make my chest go tight. And then stopping. Not because it's provably the best of every possible life I could have built. Because it's good enough, and because I chose it, and because the choosing is the only part of this that was ever actually going to be mine. Asterisk. The evening before the lecture, Julian made his mother tea, the way he did every evening now, warming the pot first the way she liked because Etienne had always forgotten to and she'd never once let him forget it. His mother, Odile, sat in the chair by the window with Robert's letter's existence unknown to her. Julian had not told her about it, had not decided whether he ever would, and watched the street the way she'd watched it every evening since the telegram. You've been quiet, she said, not looking away from the window. I've had a lot to think about. You always say that when you don't want to tell me what you're thinking about. Julian set her cup down on the small table beside her chair and sat on the arm of the sofa across from her, the way he had as a boy when he wanted to ask her something he suspected she wouldn't like. If I told you there was a way I could do something for Etienne, he said carefully, something further away than here, would you want to know about it? Odile turned from the window then, and looked at him for a long moment with an expression he found difficult to read, though he would spend years afterward believing she had understood everything immediately in that single look, the letter, Robert, the whole shape of what he was not quite asking her permission for, because some part of him already knew that asking would be its own kind of cowardice, a way of making her the one who chose so that he would never have to carry it alone. I buried one son already this year, she said, evenly, not as an accusation, simply as a fact laid on the table between them. I am not going to tell you to stay, Julian. I want you to hear that clearly, because I could tell you to stay, and you would probably do it, and then some part of you would resent me for the rest of your life, quietly, in a way neither of us would ever be able to name. And I am not going to tell you to go, either, because if something happened to you there too, I could not survive having told you to walk toward it. So I am going to do the only fair thing left to a mother in my position, which is to tell you nothing at all, and let you decide, and love you exactly the same amount no matter what you decide, for as long as I am still here to do it. Julian had gone to bed that night more unsettled than if she had simply told him to stay, because some small, unexamined part of him had been hoping, all along, that she would make the decision for him the way Sartor had refused to, and here she was, this last possible authority, closing the same door gently, with the same absolute finality. Asterisk. He had known Robert since they were 9 years old, since a schoolyard fight over a football that neither of them, decades later, could quite remember the specifics of, except that it had ended with both of them bleeding from the nose and somehow inseparable from that afternoon onward. Robert had been at the funeral for Etienne. There had been no body, only a service, a coffin weighted with stones because the Germans had not released what remained of him, and it was Robert who had stood beside Julian afterward on the church steps and said, quietly, so Odile wouldn't hear, when this is over, whatever's left of it, I'm going to go finish it properly. You should come. Julian had said nothing at the time. He had assumed, in the numb weeks that followed, that the invitation would simply dissolve the way most wartime promises dissolve, made in grief and never meant to be collected on. But Robert had gone anyway 3 months later without waiting for Julian's answer, and the letter now folded twice in Julian's coat pocket, soft at the creases from having been read too many times, was the collection notice on a promise Julian wasn't sure he'd actually made. Come when you can, Robert had written, in the cramped, slanting hand Julian had known since they were boys, copying out Latin declensions side by side. There's a place for you here, and God knows there's enough left to finish. I think of it in more than I probably let on in my other letters. I think you'd want to be here for at least some part of what comes next. But I also understand better than you might think if you don't come. Your mother has already given this war more than her fair share. Nobody who knows what she's lost would think less of you for staying. I say this as your oldest friend and not as a recruiter. Whatever you decide it because it's what you actually want, and not because you think it's what Etienne would have wanted, or what I want, or what anyone standing outside your particular house, looking in from the outside, thinks looks like courage. I've seen enough men out here who came for the wrong reasons. It doesn't end well for them, one way or another. Julian had read this passage more times than any other part of the letter, turning it over the way you turn over a stone looking for what's underneath it. Robert, too, it turned out, had refused to be the authority Julian wanted him to be, had gone out of his way, in fact, to specifically decline the role, in almost the same words Sartor had used in that narrow, tobacco-smelling office, in almost the same words his own mother had used from her chair by the window. Everyone Julian turned to, it seemed, understood something he was only beginning to understand himself, that handing him an answer, however kindly meant, would not actually be a kindness. It would only be one more voice for him to obey or resent, instead of a decision he could stand inside as his own, whichever way it went. Sartor does not linger in that packed Paris hall on comfort. He says the word anguish and means it precisely, not fear of any particular danger, but the deeper vertigo of realizing that in choosing anything at all, a person is not merely picking an item off a shelf of pre-approved goods. They are, in the act of choosing, implicitly declaring what a human life ought to prioritize, casting a vote for all of humanity with no ballot box and no one to check the math. He tells the room about a young man. He does not use Julian's name. Out of some private courtesy Julian will always be grateful for, torn between his mother and the war, and he tells them flatly that he had refused to choose for him, because to choose for him would have been a lie, a pretense that Sartor possessed some formula the young man himself lacked. There is no such formula. There was never a formula. Kant's categorical imperative cannot weigh a mother's grief against a brother's memory. The Christian command to love does not specify whose love, in this exact moment, comes first. Somewhere near the back, Julian listens to his own unnamed dilemma being handed to 500 strangers, and feels something shift that he will spend years trying to describe accurately to himself. It is not relief, exactly. Sartor has given him nothing, no answer, no direction, no absolution. But there is something almost bearable in hearing that the absence of an answer is not a personal failing, not evidence that Julian is uniquely lost among men who otherwise know what they are doing. It is, apparently, the condition. Every single person crushed into this overheated hall, judges and grocers and widows and students, is standing at the edge of the same unmarked field, and none of them get handed a map, and all of them, Sartre is telling them, are nonetheless responsible for the road they take across it. Sartre goes on. He tells the crowd that when a man marries, has children, chooses even to withdraw from society entirely and live as a hermit, he is not making a private decision that concerns only himself. He is affirming through the act of choosing it the value of marriage or solitude or withdrawal as something worth choosing at all, and in that affirmation he is implicitly recommending it to everyone, whether he intends to or not, the way a man building a house on a hillside is implicitly declaring through the act of building there that hillsides are the kind of place houses belong. There is no such thing, Sartre insists, as a choice that stays sealed inside one life. Every choice throws a value out into the world and says this is what a person could be. This is what a person, in this situation, might reasonably become. A man near the front, emboldened perhaps by the heat and the crush and the strange, leveling intimacy of 500 people packed too close together to maintain their usual composure, calls out that this sounds like an excuse for total moral chaos. If there is no fixed standard, he shouts, then how is anyone to be criticized for any choice at all, however monstrous? Sartre does not flinch from this. He answers that a man in bad faith, a man who lies to himself about the nature of his own freedom, can rightly be judged for that specific lie, for pretending, say, that his cruelty was simply his nature and chosen, when in fact he chooses it fresh each time he practices it. What Sartre refuses is not judgment. It is only the fantasy that judgment can be handed down from some authority outside human beings themselves, that there exists, waiting in a book or a commandment or a law of history, a verdict pre-written and merely waiting to be read aloud. There is no such book. There is only what people, choosing, make of themselves and of each other, and the responsibility for that is total, and it cannot be outsourced, not to God, not to history, not to nature, not to a philosopher standing on a stage in a hall too small to hold the crowd that has come to hear him refuse to give them an easier answer than the one they already, secretly, suspected was the only one on offer. Julian walks home that night through blacked-out streets only recently allowed to burn their lamps again, and somewhere along the route, without any dramatic sense of decision, without a lightning bolt or a sudden clarity, he understands that he has already been choosing this whole time, in the 5 weeks since the letter arrived, choosing every single day he stayed and did not leave to stay. He had been telling himself he hadn't decided yet, that the decision remained pending, external, waiting to be handed down. But there was no pending. There was only a string of ordinary Tuesdays in which he made his mother tea, and did not buy a train ticket, and called this indecision, when it had in fact been, the entire time, an answer, the only kind of answer Sartre had ever promised existed. Not a verdict revealed. A verdict enacted, one unremarkable day at a time, by a person free enough that even his hesitation counted as a choice. He does not know, walking home, whether staying is right. He suspects with the same clarity that right was never going to be available to him in the form he'd been hoping for, a stamp of approval from some authority outside himself. What he has instead is smaller, and he is beginning to understand, sturdier, the fact that if he stays it will be because he chose to, awake, without pretending the choice belonged to fate or duty or his mother's need instead of to him. And if that is all freedom ever offers, not the right answer, but the unborrowed ownership of whichever answer you give, then perhaps, he thinks, turning onto his own dark street, that has to be enough, because nothing else is on offer, and never was, and never will be. Asterisk. A few days after the call with Cass, David found her at the kitchen table with her laptop open to the offer letter, which she had read so many times the words had started to lose their shape, the way any word does if you stare at it long enough. "You keep saying you want me to do what's right for me," she said, without looking up. "I need you to stop saying that." David sat down across from her slowly, the way he did most things. "Okay. Why?" Because it sounds like generosity, but it's not really. It's you handing the whole decision back to me and calling it a gift. And maybe it is a kind of gift, I don't know. But it also means if I go, and it's a mistake, you get to have never really weighed in, and if I stay, and I resent it in 10 years, you get to say you never asked me to. You get to be the one who was careful the entire time. I don't get that. Whatever I do, I'm the one who did it. David was quiet for a while. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something, the same 3 notes, over and over. What do you want me to say instead? He asked finally. Do you want me to tell you to stay? I don't know. Maybe. Sometimes. But if you told me to stay, and I stayed, and then in 5 years I felt like I'd given something up, I think I'd resent that more than anything you could say right now. I think I'd tell myself I only stayed because you asked me to, and I'd never really had to find out what I would have chosen if it had only ever been mine. So there's no version of this, David said slowly, where I say anything useful. I don't think there is. I think that's the actual problem. I've been treating you like a missing piece of information, like if you just said the right sentence the decision would resolve itself and I could stop feeling like this. But you're not missing information. You're just someone who loves me and doesn't know either, the same as I don't know, and I think I've been asking you to pretend otherwise so I wouldn't have to be alone with it. David reached across the table and closed her laptop gently, not as a demand that she stop thinking about it, but almost as a small mercy, a temporary reprieve. I don't know what you should do, he said. I mean that completely. I have a preference, obviously. I'd be lying if I said I didn't, and someday, if you want, I'll tell you what it is. But I'm not going to let you carry my preference around like it was the deciding vote. Whatever you choose, I want it to be because it was actually yours. I'd rather have you here because you chose it, freely, eyes open, than have you here because I talked you into it and some part of you always wonders. Mara looked at him for a long moment and felt, for the first time in 5 weeks, something closer to gratitude than fear, not because the decision had gotten any easier, but because he had just, without either of them naming it, refused to become the authority she'd been quietly begging him to be, in almost exactly the way Sarta had refused Julian, in almost exactly the way her own mother never would. Asterisk. Mara did not decide that night or the next or even by the time the offer's deadline had shrunk to 2 weeks. What changed was smaller than a decision, and, she would later think, more useful. She stopped waiting for the choice to arrive pre-labeled as correct. She stopped treating David's carefulness, or her mother's certainty, or her sister's certainty, as data she was missing rather than opinions she had already fully heard. She noticed the way you notice a habit only once someone points it out, how often she said I don't know what to do when what she meant was I know exactly what I'm leaning toward, and I am too afraid of being the one who's responsible for it going wrong. She went back to the cereal aisle on an unrelated Tuesday for actual cereal and stood in front of the wall of boxes and noticed, almost with amusement, that she made the choice in about 11 seconds. Nothing had changed about the boxes. What had changed was smaller and stranger. She had stopped auditioning, in her head, an imaginary authority who would later be asked to confirm she'd picked correctly. There was no such authority. There had never been one. She picked the box, put it in the cart, and moved on to the next aisle, which held its own smaller wall, its own smaller and entirely survivable 4 seconds of choosing. 9 days before the deadline, she told David she was staying, not because staying was correct, she said, and she wanted him to hear this part clearly, but because when she imagined herself 5 years from now having left, she felt a specific, nameable grief about the specific life they had built that she was not willing to trade for an unspecific, better-sounding one in a city she had visited twice. She told him this was not a rescue he had performed by being patient, and not a sacrifice she was making for him either. It was hers. If it went badly, it would be because she had chosen it freely with her eyes open, and she did not want him or her mother or her sister carrying so much as an ounce of that outcome in either direction, ever. David, to his credit, understood immediately what she meant and did not try to make it smaller by telling her she'd made the right choice. He only said, "Okay," and reached for her hand, and that was, Mara thought later, exactly the correct thing for him to say because it left the choice standing where it belonged entirely, uncomfortably, and finally hers. Asterisk. She wrote the email that same night at the kitchen table, with David reading in the next room and pointedly not asking to see the screen. She wrote it 3 times. The first draft was too apologetic, full of phrases like "I hope you understand" and "this was an incredibly difficult decision," as though she owed the hiring director a full accounting of her private reasoning, as though his understanding was something she needed in order for the decision to count. She deleted it. The second draft swung too far the other way, brisk to the point of coldness, and reading it back she recognized uncomfortably the shape of someone trying to prove to herself that the decision hadn't cost her anything, which was its own kind of lie. The third draft she kept short and honest and sent before she could revise it a 4th time. She was deeply grateful for the offer and had thought about it seriously for over a month, and she had decided, for reasons that were personal rather than professional, to stay in her current position. She wished them well with the search. She did not say "I hope this is the right decision" because she had, somewhere in the last hour, quietly stopped believing that sentence meant anything. There was no version of right waiting to confirm itself later, the way a test result confirms itself. There was only the decision, sent at 11:42 on a Tuesday night, and whatever she made of the years that came after it. She read it once more before hitting send, and noticed, with something between fear and a strange, quiet pride, that her hand did not shake. Then she sent it and closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the small, ordinary kitchen that was now by her own hand and no one else's, going to remain the kitchen her life happened in. Asterisk. A year later, almost to the day, Mara stood in front of a different wall, not cereal this time, but paint chips, dozens of nearly identical shades of white for a nursery she and David had started tentatively to plan, and noticed with something like amusement that she no longer cried in front of walls of options. She still felt the old flicker of dread when a decision mattered, still felt the small, familiar pull toward asking someone else to confirm she'd picked correctly. But she recognized it now, the way you recognize a weather pattern you've lived through before, and she had learned, mostly, to let it pass through her without organizing her whole afternoon around it. She had turned down Lisbon 9 days before the deadline, and there had been, in the year since, exactly the kind of quiet, occasional ache she had expected, a client's name mentioned at a conference, a photograph a former colleague posted from a roof up in the Alfama district, a small, specific pang that had nothing dramatic about it and everything ordinary. The kind of ache that comes from having chosen one good thing and therefore not having the other good thing forever, the way choosing anything at all means not choosing everything else. She had wondered, more than once, quietly, at 2 in the morning, what the other version of her life might have looked like. She suspected she always would. But it had never curdled into the specific, corrosive resentment she'd seen in other people, in a former co-worker who'd stayed in a job for 15 years because her father had told her it was the responsible thing to do, and who now spoke about those 15 years the way you'd speak about a debt someone else had taken out in your name, in an old college friend who'd left a good relationship because everyone around her insisted she was too young to settle down, and who now, a decade on, seemed to blame those voices more than she'd ever managed to actually miss the relationship itself. Mara did not carry that particular flavor of regret, and she had come to understand, slowly, that its absence was not luck. It was the direct, traceable result of having refused, in the end, to let Cass or her mother or David make the choice for her. Whatever she'd given up, she had given it up herself, with her eyes open, and that fact alone seemed to change the entire chemistry of how the loss sat in her. She found herself that afternoon in the paint aisle, thinking not about Sartor exactly, whose name she could still barely pronounce with any confidence, but about the shape of what she'd read that sleepless night on the couch, condemned to be free, and how strange it was that a phrase meant to describe a burden had turned out, a year on, to be the thing she returned to most often for something like comfort. Not because it promised her the ache would ever fully go away. It hadn't promised her anything, but because it had given her, at the exact moment she needed it, a way of understanding that the ache was not evidence she'd chosen badly. It was simply what it felt like to be a person who chooses at all, who stands in front of a wall of paint chips or cereal boxes or job offers or entire possible lives, and picks without a guarantee, without a verdict handed down from anywhere outside herself, and then goes on, afterward, being the person who picked. She reached out and took down a chip labeled something absurd, something like Quiet Morning or First Light, one of dozens of nearly identical off-whites that would have looked to any objective observer functionally indistinguishable from the ones beside it. It did not matter, she understood now, in the particular way it had once felt unbearable that it might not matter. It only had to be hers. Asterisk. Robert came home in the spring of 1946, thinner than Julian remembered, with a scar along his jaw he never fully explained, and a habit new since the war of going quiet in the middle of conversations for slightly too long before continuing as though nothing had happened. He and Julian met for coffee within a week of his return, at a cafe neither of them could really afford, and for a long time neither of them mentioned the letter at all, as though by unspoken agreement they had decided it belonged to a version of both of them that no longer quite existed. It was Robert, eventually, who brought it up. "I wondered sometimes, out there," he said, turning his cup slowly on its saucer, "whether you'd come. I want you to know I never held it against you not staying. I meant what I wrote. I still mean it." "I know," Julian said. "I never doubted that you meant it." "Do you ever wish you had? Come, I mean." Julian considered the question honestly, the way he'd learned, somewhere in the last year, to consider most things that used to frighten him. Sometimes. Late at night, mostly. "I wonder what it would have been like to have done something with my hands about it, Ian, instead of just tea and waiting. But it doesn't sit on me the way I think it would have if someone else had made the decision for me. If you had talked me into it, or my mother had ordered me to go, or Sartor had simply told me plainly what to do, I think I would carry this differently. I think I would resent whoever had decided it a little every single day, whichever way it had gone. Instead, I just have the ordinary, survivable wondering that I suspect everyone carries about the life they didn't live. It's lighter than I expected regret to be." Robert nodded slowly and did not press further, and Julian understood, watching him, that Robert carried his own version of the same arithmetic, had chosen to go freely, with his eyes open, in spite of every voice, including his own letter to Julian, that had refused to tell him it was the right thing to do, and now sat across a cafe table with a scar and a new habit of silence, and did not, as far as Julian could tell, hate the choice, even on the days it must have been hardest to live inside. They did not talk about it again for many years. When they did, much later, both of them older, both of them fathers by then, it was mostly to agree, in the easy shorthand of very old friends, that the worst thing either of them had seen in other men who came back from that decade was not fear and was not even grief. It was the particular, corrosive bitterness of men who had let somebody else hold the pen, fathers, priests, commanding officers, public opinion, and who now, decades on, seemed unable to stop reciting the names of everyone but themselves whenever the subject of the war came up. Asterisk. Years later, long after the war, long after the packed hall at the club maintenance had become a footnote in 100 textbooks, long after Julian's mother had died peacefully in the same chair by the same window, having lived to see her surviving son marry and eventually become a father himself, Julian would sometimes tell his own daughter the story of the night he went to hear a strange, cross-eyed philosopher say something that had frightened and steadied him in the same breath. His daughter, hearing it as a teenager standing at the edge of her own uncertain choices, would ask him the obvious question, did he ever regret staying? Did he ever wonder what would have happened if he'd gone? Julian would consider this for a while, the way he considered most things, and then say that of course he'd wondered, that the wondering never fully stopped, that some version of the other road stayed lit faintly somewhere at the edge of his mind for the rest of his life. But he would also say that the wandering had never once curdled into the particular, corrosive regret he saw in men who had let other people choose for them, men who had gone to war because their fathers expected it, or stayed home because someone told them to, and who spent the following decades quietly, permanently furious at whoever they'd allowed to hold the pen. He, at least, had held the pen himself. Whatever the sentence turned out to be, he had written it, and there was, he told his daughter, a kind of peace available inside that fact that was not available anywhere else, not a peace that removed the weight of having chosen, but one that made the weight feel, finally, like something worth carrying because it was unmistakably his own. His daughter did not entirely understand this at the time. She would understand it much later, standing in a doorway of her own, facing a choice no one else could make for her, feeling the old, dizzy, unmistakable drop in her stomach, the same one, though she would never know it, that had once passed through a packed and overheated hall in Paris, and through a woman standing in a cereal aisle decades later, crying over nothing at all, and over everything. Her name was Claire, and the choice, when it came, was smaller than a war and larger than cereal, which is to say it was the ordinary size choices actually come in for most people, most of the time, whether to leave a stable, respected position at a hospital in Lyon to take a much riskier post at a new clinic 200 kilometers away, founded by a former colleague she believed in but could not be certain would still exist in 3 years. She had called her father the week the offer arrived, expecting, if she was honest with herself, that he would tell her what to do, that some paternal authority, accumulated over 30 years of being the person who'd made his own famous, unspoken peace with an old choice, would finally cash itself in on her behalf. He had not done that. He had listened, mostly, the way he always did, asking a question here and there, and when she finally asked him directly, "Papa, what would you do?" he had gone quiet for a moment in a way she recognized because she had seen him do it once or twice before, usually when the subject of the war came up. "I can tell you a story," he said, "about a night I went to hear a philosopher speak a long time before you were born, when I was not much older than you are now and trying to decide something that felt, at the time, like the largest decision of my life. And the philosopher refused to tell me what to do. My own mother refused. My oldest friend, in a letter, refused. Everyone I turned to, one after another, declined the exact thing I was asking for, which was permission, someone else's signature on the bottom of my decision, so that whichever way it went, some part of the blame or the credit would belong to them instead of entirely to me." "That sounds frustrating," Claire said. It was, at the time, furiously frustrating. But I've come to think it was the only honest thing any of them could have done, because the alternative, someone else deciding, and me simply living out their verdicts, would have cost me something I didn't understand the value of until much later. It would have cost me the thing that makes a life actually feel like yours, rather than a life that happened to you while you stood nearby. So you won't tell me what to do?" "I won't tell you what to do," he said, and she could hear, even over the phone, something gentle in his voice that softened what might otherwise have sounded like a refusal. "But I will tell you that whatever you choose, you will carry it far more lightly if it is genuinely yours than if it is mine, or your mother's, or anyone else's opinion wearing your name. That's the only wisdom I actually have to offer after all these years. It isn't much, but I found, so far, that it's enough. Claire took the position at the new clinic 4 months later, and there were nights in the early difficult year that followed when she wondered whether she had made a terrible mistake, nights when the clinic's finances looked uncertain, when she missed the easy prestige of the hospital in Lyon, when a version of her old life seemed from a distance considerably kinder than the one she had chosen. But the wondering she noticed never curdled into the bitterness she'd watched consume a colleague who had stayed in Lyon at her own mother's insistence and now, years later, still spoke of that choice as though it belonged to someone else, some absent authority she could blame for a life she'd never quite wanted. Claire's choice, whatever its cost, remained stubbornly, uncomplicatedly her own, and she found, much as her father had found decades before her, that this made an enormous, almost disproportionate difference in how the cost actually felt to carry.